Hi, I'm Robin White from FantasyWire, and I'm the guy that makes the wire fairies. The first section is entitled The Properties and Constraints of Wire. I want to walk you through what is possible with wire and what are the challenges of wire. And if we understand that, that will influence the design into the next stage. So the first section is very much sort of a PowerPoint with a voiceover because it's mostly theory, but hopefully it will be informative.
So I want to cover some of these elements. Probably one of the most significant things is the camouflage effect of the texture of the wire when it's finished. I use stainless steel wire. It's quite a bright, shiny wire, which means the surface of the wire itself is quite light, but the gaps in between are dark, and it creates what's not unlike a zebra effect, meaning that whatever setting you put it into, it can almost become invisible because all of the shapes and the planes on its surface are completely broken up, making it difficult to see. Because if you've got it in your mind where you're thinking of putting this sculpture that you're going to make, then you need to consider that the background shouldn't be too busy. You need it to have it where the sky is the backdrop, meaning that you can sort of see the silhouette. Like the photograph on the left, you'll see an awful lot of my photographs are very much taken like that. It isn't necessarily because it's a good way of photographing them, it's because if you have a busy background, you can't see the image. So I'm trying to show off this sort of sculpture's silhouette. That's one alternative. The other alternative is to have the background darkened where the fairy is well lit and the background is dark and sort of far away, so it sort of highlights the sort of fairy's detail. If you were to put a fairy into a busy background like the photograph in the middle, they virtually become invisible due to this camouflage effect. The next thing to consider is the choice of pose. Basically, you're going to ask yourself, can I make this out of wire? I suppose let's go to what you shouldn't do first. Because of this sort of camouflage effect, if you were to pick a pose similar to the drawing in the middle, which is a nice sort of image, I've sort of had a few attempts at thinking I could do a sort of sad fairy that's sort of huddled up. It's sort of quite an evocative type of picture. The problem with that pose is sort of twofold. One of which, trying to get in to actually work the shape of her body around her stomach and the inside between a sort of a stomach and a chest and all of that area would be virtually impossible to get into. When you're threading the wire around the sculpture, you need to sort of get in and sort of route it around to follow the lines of the body. So it would be incredibly difficult to get into that area. The other reason is to do with the camouflage effect that we've already covered. Now, when you're doing a drawing, you can see the detail because you haven't got the camouflage effect breaking up that shape. If I could make that fairy in wire, all you would see when you're finished is a ball of wire. You wouldn't be able to distinguish where her arms stopped and her legs began. There would just be a mass of shiny wire. So that's one reason why you wouldn't do that. Plus, her hair is hanging down her back. We'll come on to the rules of hair in a moment. But in effect, it would be extremely difficult to make, and it would just look like a mass of shiny, camouflaged blob of wire. You wouldn't actually be able to see the detail. So the one on the left, which is the original drawings that I did for Yin Yang, I'm trying to sort of pick, if you like, a shape of the body where I can sort of get all the way around the limbs to make them. So if you choose a more dramatic pose where she's spreading her arms and her legs in order to sort of create the sort of emotion of somebody dancing or something like that, it actually makes it easier to make because you can get around all of the limbs to add the wire without any difficulty. And it sort of pays, as I've sort of shown there, to sort of consider a sort of silhouette test. Because, again, if it's just a big mass of wire, you won't actually be able to see the detail. which is why most of my fairies are taken in silhouette, because you're trying to sort of show them the way that you want to show them. The photo or the drawing on the far right is questionable. It's one that I haven't made. I enjoyed doing the drawing. It's a nice idea to have a fairy sat on the end of a dandelion blowing a dandelion seed, but I question in my head as to whether or not if I finished it, whether I would be able to distinguish the fairy from the dandelion, or whether it would just look like one big massive wire. So you have to sort of consider the pose that you're making. Can I get in and around the figure, and will this camouflage effect destroy the the visibility of the detail when I've sort of finished it? Exploiting wire. I work in wire. I'm always looking for things that I could model where wire is the medium of choice. So what details can I put into the sculpture that are using wire where no other medium could go there? And that's how the sort of dandelions came about. There's no way that you could do a bronze casting of a dandelion and certainly have any sort of detail. So examples of this are the hair. There is nothing on earth that I could think of that you could model human hair as a permanent sculpture better than wire. The dandelions, the transparent wings. I moved on from chicken mesh. I actually make them out of stainless steel now, but to have a membrane that you could see, and more lately you will have seen some cobweb details in there. So again, cobwebs. I'm always looking for elements that I could introduce where wire is the actual. That's the thing that grabs people's attention. It's how did you do that? It appears to be so delicate because it's made of wire. Hair itself has a few rules. I started off the sort of picture on the top left is Glance. That fairy is actually at Trentham Garden. She was actually made as a prototype when I was trying to work out how to get the proportions right, and it was my first attempt at doing hair, but I was using fence wire, and the pose didn't have any particular movement in it. It wasn't trying to make any grand gestures. It was just a simple static standing fairy looking over her shoulder. So the hair naturally sort of flowed down her back and sort of hung over her shoulder. And it's, when you're making it, you can see the detail because you're looking at what you're making. But when you stand back, you can't distinguish where her hair ends and her body begins. And you get this sort of camouflage effect with the hair impacting on the overall picture that the viewer is seeing, and you just see a massive tangled wire. So you shouldn't really just have hair just hanging down the body. So the sort of three examples that I've sort of got here, which are things which effectively are the rules of hair, is don't have it hanging down the body. If you have it hanging, have the fairy in a pose where the hair is away from the body, like Venus in the sort of bottom right. Her pose allows the hair to just limply hang vertically down because it's not interfering with the silhouette of her body. Alternatively, like in Blown Away on the top right, this was sort of quite early on when I started, you have the hair that's been blown away from the body by the wind. And this is a sort of good device we'll look at when we're looking at design choices, but the hair should be away from the body, and it's actually increasing the effect of the emotion or the power that you're putting into the sculpture anyway. But that came about by trying to keep the hair away from the body in order to not spoil the outline of the fairy. And the last sort of example is if you could get the hair to follow the movement of the fairy, like in Yin Yang in the bottom left. What I've tried to do there is make it look to the viewer as if she's flown in a sort of circle, sort of done a loop-the-loop, and her hair is still following the path that she came through. So that creates movement by showing the flow of the hair. But again, what I'm actually doing is keeping the hair away from the body to not have this camouflage impact. So that's the constraints of wire we've covered. So we can now move on to the next video where we look at the design elements.